Hello, my name is Taryn Hiatt, and I am the Area Director for the Utah and Nevada chapters of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I found AFSP in 2002 after the loss of my father to suicide. The ignorance and hurtful comments my family had to endure sparked a fire in me. I was no stranger to suicide. I'd known it intimately most of my life. It had been a constant companion. I knew why my dad had killed himself. I had survived many of my own attempts throughout my teenage years. I also knew the insidiousness of depression and substance use disorder in attempts to cope with my own struggles. Yet even with this intimate understanding, I couldn't save him, nor could I explain the why. I began a journey into the why with my work at AFSP. 90% of those who died from suicide had a diagnosable mental health condition at the time of death. That was a data point I shared over and over. Yet, a few years ago, the CDC released a new data point stating that 54% of those who died from suicide, it wasn't recognized whether they had a mental health condition or not. So which is it? What are we missing? How do we incorporate the voices of lived experience into our research efforts? Yes, this has begun to shift in these last few years, but we still have so much work to do. While I know a lot about why my dad died from suicide, I don't know the full story. Only he does. And only he could share why he's not here any longer. But I am. I can speak to every facet that led me to that dark night of the soul. What helped me? What didn't help me? And we need the voices of those of us with lived experience to shape our efforts moving forward. In 2019, I was preparing for a keynote address on the anniversary of my dad's suicide. As I prepared, I came across a quote in The Mighty. It said, "To reduce the suicide rate, we can't just keep telling people to get help. We need to start having meaningful conversations about what kind of help is waiting for them on the other side." Research has begun to look at the care that is received by suicidal patients. We've crafted changes and initiatives like zero suicide. We have information, we've identified gaps in care of where we're losing people. But what about those of us that are still being placed on a 72-hour hold? Criminalized for opening up and speaking up about our suicidal thoughts. Housed in facilities that one floor up, where I gave birth to my babies, was a completely different atmosphere. Why are we still punishing folks? We know that crisis intervention teams, crisis intervention centers, mental health ERs, if you will, are a much better resource for those of us experiencing suicidality. Yet, we're still fighting for access, for funding to make these things a reality. Research opened our eyes to interventions that weren't helpful, such as the infamous no suicide contract that I signed many of. We know that they weren't helpful and that a crisis response plan or a safety plan was a much more effective tool because it gave me skills, it gave me steps, it provided me opportunities to seek help, to utilize coping strategies versus the hollow words in a no suicide contract that really were just to protect the provider. But why are we still waiting weeks and months to be seen, to get access to care, or having to make the decision to go bankrupt in order to pay for that care? All of these increased stressors do not help the person who is simply fighting to stay alive now. And yes, I know IRB approval is hard for those of us who are living. It's much easier to get approval when we're looking to those that we've lost. I get it. But we cannot keep looking only to the dead to understand why suicide happens. And lastly, maybe it's time that we reinvent what suicide prevention really is. Keeping people alive when their lives are difficult, painful, lacking purpose and joy, well, that's simply cruel. Suicide prevention is food, shelter, clothing, a living wage, racial equity, equality, not having to live in fear. Not having access to any one of these increases hopelessness and negatively impacts our mental health. We saw it on full display in 2020. Mental health, yes, is a vital ingredient in our suicide prevention efforts, but just as important is a sense of purpose and connectedness. Maybe it's time that we start directing our efforts in research to better understand what keeps people here. Give them a life that is worth fighting for. That is how we will continue to save lives.